Let me read our text this morning from Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, that's Jesus talking, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Friends, I remember the day when I realized I could die. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was a freshman in college, and like many teenage boys, I had the unexamined belief that I was invincible. And if you take that belief, that ingredient of invincibility, and you sprinkle a dash of testosterone over the top of it, you can get people to do some pretty reckless and self-destructive things. And my friends and I were no exception to that rule. This weekend we had gone camping in the hills not too far from our dorms, and the night before I had smoked a cigar that I pretended to enjoy. And that morning we walked to a nearby waterfall. And here's the thing about waterfalls. Right next to a waterfall is often a cliff. And here's the thing about cliffs. When you combine a cliff with an unexamined belief of invincibility and sprinkle in a dash of testosterone, what you have is an opportunity. Yeah, I don't know why, but I think it might have been something to do with the fact that we were trying to prove that we were actually men. Us four teenage boys, we decided, well, I don't know, it looks like there are a lot of handholds up there, and it is at a slight decline, so it shouldn't be that hard, and it doesn't look that high from down here. So we started climbing. No harnesses, no ropes, no real climbing experience, nobody on the ground to run back for help if one or more of us fell, no idea of what we would find at the top. Once we got there, no idea how we were supposed to get down. Basically, no common sense. And by the time we got to about 50 feet in the air, I made a pretty big mistake. I looked down. You know, it's true what they say. Don't look down. You just shouldn't do it from up there, especially if you, like me, are a little bit afraid of heights. And it was at that moment, that very specific moment, was the first time that I realized, oh, I am not invincible. I'm having a brush with death here. And I scrambled up the next 25 feet of that cliff as fast as I possibly could. And we all stood up there in a cold sweat, not really trying to acknowledge how terrified we all were and pretending like it was a great time. You see, I remember so many details about that day because I had a brush with death. And that's what happens. That's what happens when you have a brush with death. You remember it in vivid detail, no matter how long ago it happened. And that, I think, is why we have such an incredibly detailed story from the Apostle Mark in our text today. You see, he throws in all kinds of vivid and gratuitous seeming details here. Like, for example, we don't just see the boat that Jesus and the disciples are in. We see the other boats that are alongside of them. for no apparent reason. We also see in Mark's version of the story not just a storm, but a furious squall, a Lailaps megalou. This is Mark's way of saying an incredibly fearsome windstorm. And if Mark had a little bit more time, he might have included details like the fact that the Sea of Galilee sits in a depression that is 700 feet below sea level, and it's surrounded by hills. And when wind comes over those hills and it mixes with the right air temperature, surprisingly sudden and violent storms can come upon the Sea of Galilee. It's true to this day. Not only boats, but other automobiles can be swamped at the Sea of Galilee. If you go to the western shore of the Sea of Galilee today and you were to park in the parking lot by the beach, there will be notices, warning signs that tell you, beware when sudden winds kick up, this nice little beach and this nice little parking lot could become a flood zone. He also gives us details that we wouldn't expect about Jesus, about his sleep. He doesn't just say Jesus was asleep. He says Jesus was asleep in the stern, in the back of the boat. And he was asleep. We even see in Mark's viewpoint the cushion that Jesus slept on. It's coming back all so vividly to Mark. And we don't just see Jesus sleep very vividly. We see the reaction and the response of the disciples incredibly vividly. See, they don't just wake Jesus up, and they don't just wake him up with some generic, "Oh, we're going to drown," sort of exclamation. They wake Jesus up with the much more specific and frankly much more heartbreaking cry. Don't you care if we drown? Don't you care? See, they're about to die. The waves are breaking over the side of the boat. The water is rushing in faster than they can bail it out. And these fishermen, these professional seafarers, are terrified out of their minds because this is like nothing they have ever encountered before. And Jesus is back there on a comfortable cushion, asleep. And they wonder to themselves, don't you care? I think it's important for us to key in on those words, because when we hear Jesus later on ask them about their lack of faith, oftentimes those of us who have read this story before, we think that their lack of faith has to do with lack of belief in Jesus' power to help them, power to save them, power to affect the situation. And at least in Mark's telling, that doesn't seem to be the reason that Jesus says they lack faith. I mean, think about it. Why would they wake him up if they didn't think he could do anything about it? What a waste of time in a life-threatening situation. Why would they ask him, don't you care, if he couldn't even do anything about their situation anyway? Now, no doubt the disciples were surprised and they didn't expect the extent of the power that Jesus would have in that situation, but they knew from watching him in the past that he did have the power to do something. That's why they woke him up. It's why they said, don't you care? See, it's not that they lacked faith that Jesus could do something. They lacked faith that Jesus would do something. It's not that they lacked faith in Jesus' capacity. They lacked faith in Jesus' compassion. It's not that they lacked faith in Jesus' greatness. They lacked faith in his goodness. Don't you care if we drown? I wonder if you ever felt like crying out to God with those words. I wonder if you have cried out to God with those words. Don't you care? Don't you care if we drown. If you have cried out to God with those words, or if you feel like it, you wouldn't be alone. And not only would you be in the company of the disciples, you'd be in the company of people like David, like King David, who wrote Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? And he asks God about why he seems to be abandoning him in the suffering of his mind, seeming depression and anxiety. He says, how long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? You would be in the company of prophets like Habakkuk if you were crying out to God in this way, who was witnessing injustice and just couldn't take this storm of injustice anymore. And he says, how long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not see. You do not save. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? In other words, don't you care if we drown? Don't you care about COVID-19? Don't you care about racism? Don't you care about police brutality? Don't you care about corruption? Don't you care about people losing their jobs, about losing their businesses, losing their livelihoods? Don't you care about people who are living outside without proper housing or without health care? Don't you care about our changing climate and the disasters that it's bringing in our world? Don't you care about my husband's addiction? Don't you care about my depression, my anxiety? Don't you care about my financial situation? Don't you care about my marriage? Don't you care about my desperate loneliness? Don't you care about my health? Don't you care? We're dying over here. Don't you care? Maybe you've prayed that prayer. I know I have. Or maybe you feel that prayer, but you maybe haven't had the strength or the honesty with yourself or with God to put it into words. I know for Christians, sometimes that can come from a place of feeling like we're not allowed to question God. Come from the place of knowing that he cares. We know it in our heads anyway, and so we tell it to our hearts, which is not the wrong thing to do, but if it keeps us from being honest about how we're feeling with God, we're going to be at a loss. He gave us the Psalms to pray back to him, and so Psalm 13 is on the ballot. How long, O Lord? And others of you, maybe you're not even sure if you believe in God. And so, yeah, you do have this feeling of like, why does God care? Why isn't he doing anything? But not being 100% sure of God and not being 100% sure of prayer, you don't let yourself express that because you don't want to sort of commit yourself to God's existence. I just want to say to you, maybe that feeling inside of you is coming from someplace. Maybe that intuition that there is a God who should care is telling you something important. But no matter if you've prayed this prayer or if you haven't prayed this prayer, friends, all of us at some point in our lives are going to experience a furious squall, an incredible and overwhelming windstorm that the suddenness of and violence of which can make us feel helpless and vulnerable. And if you haven't experienced that in your life, you will. Many of you have experienced multiple of those types of events, even multiple of those events this year. And when you do experience that, you might be tempted not just to doubt God's power, not just to doubt his capacity, but to doubt his compassion for you. Not just to doubt his greatness, but to doubt his goodness to his creator, to his creation. And when you're in that place of doubt, I want to encourage you to at least be honest and tell Jesus. You know why? It'll give him a chance to respond. Just like he does in this passage, it will give him a chance to respond and to show you and tell you that he does, in fact, care. And in this passage, he gives us 3 evidences of the fact that he does care deeply for us. The first evidence is his promise. The second is their past. And the third is his proactive grace. So his promise, their past, and his proactive grace. Let's look at his promise first, because it's the first thing that we see in this passage. If you look at verse 35, you will see Jesus say, what? Let us go over to the other side. He doesn't say, let me go. He doesn't say, let us go to the middle of the lake and then we'll see what happens. Jesus says, let's go together to the other side. And here's the thing about Jesus. When he says we're going to do something, it's going to happen. When he says we're going to do something, that's a promise. And I want to say with Dr. Tony Evans this morning, be careful not to allow your problems to override God's promises. Be careful not to allow your problems to override God's promises. You see, when Jesus offers us his promise, we know, friends, that he cares not only about us, but he cares about his own character, his own faithfulness, his own trustworthiness to his word. And so when he gives us a promise, you can take that to the bank. If you're wondering if he cares about your situation, all you have to do is look and see if he has promised you anything, or specifically what he might have promised you in this situation. Maybe it's not a promise to get out of jail free card, but he does promise to be with you. And we're going to come to a few of those promises in just a minute. He offers the disciples his promise as the first evidence of the fact that he cares that they get over to the other side. The second evidence he gives them to bolster their faith is their own past experiences. Did you hear what Jesus said when he starts to talk to his disciples? He says, not, do you not have faith? No, Jesus says, do you still not have faith? He says, do you still not have faith? He is implying that they should look back to their past to see what kind of person Jesus has been in their lives so far, that with everything that they have gone through together, that they should know by now, without a shadow of a doubt, that he cares for them. It's almost as if Jesus is looking in the eyes of his disciples one by one and saying to them, James, don't you remember just a few weeks ago when that man had this demon raging inside of him like a great inner storm. And I said the same thing to that demon that I said to this storm. Be quiet. Go away. And it did. Or Simon, remember when we were at your family's house and your mother-in-law was sick with a fever in bed, and I went to her and I gave her my hand and her fever left? Or Andrew, don't you remember when that man with leprosy just a couple weeks ago came up to me and he asked me to make him clean, and I didn't stand off of him and protect myself. I didn't protect my religious cleanliness or my physical health. No, I went to him and I made him clean like he asked. John, you got to remember. This was just a few days ago. You got to remember that they lowered a man who was unable to walk on a mat through the roof. And I forgave his sins and I told him, get up, take your mat, and go home. And he did. Or Levi. Oh, Levi. You were a tax collector, man. You were You were a traitor and an outcast to your own oppressed people. And I called you to follow me. And then, don't you remember? I wasn't ashamed to come to your house and eat with your friends, even though the religious authorities of the day criticized me for doing that. Brothers, how could you still not have faith that I care for you? If I've cared for you and for all of these people all of this time, what does your record with me show? Jesus invites them to look at their history together of his compassion and believe. And if that's not enough to bolster their faith, he encourages them, or I should say, he does a sort of show and tell of his proactive grace. Did you notice that when the disciples come to him furious in the middle of this storm, and they basically accuse him of, let's say, criminally negligent homicide? Like he could do something, but he is not willing to do something to save their lives. Jesus doesn't rebuke his disciples. He rebukes the wind and the waves. The Bible says he said to his disciples, do you still lack faith? But it says that he rebukes the wind and the waves. You see, Jesus' first response to our cry of lament, to our cry out for help, even if it's a cry that shows that at some level we are lacking faith in his goodness, his first response is not to reshape our faith. His first response is rescue. His first response is not rebuke of his disciples, it's rebuke of the evil situation in their lives. And did you notice now that grace is proactive in the sense that it doesn't require the already formed faith of the disciples. It simply doesn't. They haven't even had a discussion about faith yet, much less the reality of faith. I mean, Jesus, after the calming of the storm, still indicates that they lack faith. But even before that, he saves them, he rescues them, because his rescue is not predicated on their faith. It's predicated on their plight. It's not predicated on their trust in him. It's predicated on their trouble. You see, the fact that Jesus' grace is proactive, that it comes before their faith, is the sure proof and evidence that he is doing it simply because he cares. He's not doing it because he owes them anything. He's not doing it because they've earned it. They haven't been good enough to be savable. He's doing it simply because he cares. That's his proactive grace. He gives his disciples all of these evidences of the fact that he cares. And friends, he gives the same evidences to us today. If you are wondering, God, don't you care? Jesus, don't you care that we're drowning? You need to marshal by your side. You need to bring up his promises, your past, your experiences, and his proactive grace. You need to marshal his promises to your aid and to your side. You need to marshal promises like the promise in Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. You need to marshal promises to your side like the one Jesus made to his disciples in John 16:33. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. You need to marshal promises to your side when you're exhausted, when you're beat up and worn down. Like the one he gave us in Matthew 11 verses 28 and 29 when he said, "Come to me." Many of you know this one. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. We need to marshal the promises of God, like the one in Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. Friends, I know that in the middle of the storm, when the waves are crashing over you, it is difficult to remind yourselves of the promises of God. It is difficult to remind ourselves of the promises of God, but it is precisely for the middle of the storm that he gave us these promises, so that we would remember and have faith and be encouraged and given the strength to persevere. That's why I would encourage you, especially. So maybe you're sitting here this morning, you're like, I'm not in the middle of a storm. I actually am having a really great season right now. Maybe you're one of the people who's able to work from home, and it's actually been a really rich time with your family or with your spouse, or just alone time because you like to be alone. And maybe you're thinking, well, I don't really identify with this whole storm thing. I don't, it's not really what I'm experiencing right now. Especially you, when it's not the storm time, when the seas are calm and the waves are smooth. Take some time. Maybe it's in the morning, maybe it's at your lunch break, maybe it's at the dinner table with your family or your roommates, to soak in the promises of God. Memorize them. Go back earlier in this sermon and just look up the ones that I just said and memorize them now, because if you bury them in your heart today, you can pull them up when you need them tomorrow. But I would encourage you to go even further than remembering and memorizing the promises of God, so they can encourage you when you're in the middle of the storm. I want to encourage you to look at your past. Look at your past. I mean, for me, when I look back, when I'm in a struggling time, a stormy time in my life, one of the seasons that I look back to is just a couple of years ago when Steph and I were basically evicted overnight. Our apartment was destroyed, and at 3 a.m. in the morning, we had to take a bag of our clothes and leave. And we never went back to that apartment or 75% of those belongings. And I remember how God provided a church family who brought us food for every meal for weeks. I remember how God provided, and we counted 21 households who invited us to live with them free of charge until we got back on our feet. We are where we are today on the other side of that lake because Jesus cared for me, cared for Steph, cared for us. And you are where you are today because Jesus cared for you. I want you to think about your life. You're here right now. The very fact that you are here, that you are listening to what I am saying, that we are engaging together, means that you have survived something. You have survived some storms in your life. And whether or not you were able to recognize at the time that it was Jesus who said to the wind and the waves to be quiet and calm down, it was him that brought you through. And if you are able, I want to encourage you to, if you're able to think about, recall those times, share, right now even, go and share a brief version of that on the public chat. Tell that story to yourself, tell it to your friends, write it in your journal, tell it in all its vivid detail, as I'm sure you'll be able to do, because whenever you have a brush with death or a brush with trauma or a brush with pain or a brush with any kind of furious squall in your life, you remember the details. Tell that story and tell it all the way through till you get to the other side. And it will help you in the storm that you're experiencing right now to remember that, oh yeah, Jesus does care. If he asks me, do you still not have faith? We'll be able to say, yeah, no, I'm looking back. And I do. And if that's not enough, I want you to remember his proactive grace. His proactive grace in your life. Not only the many things in your past experiences that he has given you that you did not earn, that he did not owe you, but also the way that his grace has been proactive for this world. We see while our world was still in chaos, God came for us. He sent his son. While we still had no idea how to live or why to live that way, Jesus taught us on the Sermon on the Mount, in the parables, and in so many other ways. And while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. You see, the forces of evil, the winds of the evil one were raging against Jesus, against God's plan and purposes for his people and his world, in all of its political power and all of its religious power and all of its social power. The forces of evil were raging against God. And when his people looked around on Good Friday to see where was Jesus in all of this, he is slumped over on the cross and then buried, asleep perhaps forever in the tomb. And you gotta believe, as they were experiencing this, the disciples are like, don't you care? Don't you care that what the Romans are doing to us? Don't you care? That he was the hope. We thought he was the hope of the world. But friends, on the third day, that storm was stilled. On the third day, Jesus rose from the dead. He got up, and that tomb was empty. And we are like, if we're looking at this experience of the resurrection, we're like, who in the world is this? Not just the wind and the waves, but even death obeys him. So if you're in the midst of a storm, remember that he did all of that. He came, he taught, he died, he rose again. He did all of that before you or I ever had a drop of faith. If he was waiting on us to die on the cross until we had faith, he'd be checking his watch today. He wouldn't have been up there yet. But Jesus did all of that before we had faith, not because he owed us anything, not because we had earned anything by being moral or being good people or having enough faith in him. No, Jesus did all of that before we had faith so that we would know, as we look back on the cross, as we look back on the resurrection, he did that simply and purely because he cares for us. That is good news. If you are in the midst of the storm this morning, if you are wondering whether Jesus actually cares for this world or for you, I know that it's hard to see when the waves are breaking over you, but I want to encourage you to just pick up your head, look at the cross and the resurrection. Look at Jesus rising from the dead and telling death, you be quiet, be gone. You have no power over them anymore. And remember just how much he cares.